Welcome to the 8th episode of ThinkFest Conversations. Today, we are honored and privileged to have with us Professor Daron Acemoglu. He is the Institute Professor at MIT, which is the highest possible ranking that you can achieve as a professor at that university. He, after completing his PhD at the London School of Economics, has had a trailblazing career. He won the John Clark Bates Medal, which is awarded to the finest economist under the age of 40. There's a very strong correlation between people who win this prize and those who win the Nobel. So we're all rooting for Professor Acemoglu that he will achieve that milestone as well. He also has won the John von Neumann Prize, which is awarded by students. So, he combines two very special things, that he's a first-class academic, but he's also a very good teacher. And the two don't always go together. So this is a very, very special thing. Professor Acemoglu's area of interest is specifically institutions and how institutions have an impact or determine economic performance through time. By institutions, let me just give you a quick definition before we dive in with Professor Acemoglu. Are rules of the game, or formal institutions include rules and laws, and informal institutions include norms and conventions. Together, we call these the institutional structure. And Professor Acemoglu, in his fantastic book, Why Nations Fail, lays out a complete theory of why some countries are rich and others are poor. So, Professor Acemoglu, please tell us, why are some rich and why are others poor? Just tell us, give us a summary of your theory.
Thanks, Savail. Well, I wish I knew the full answer to that question, because that's the million-dollar question for social science. A lot of hardship around the world is caused by poverty, and poverty has systematic causes, and it's hotly debated. My perspective here developed jointly with James Robinson in dozens of articles, and then in 3 books that Jim and I wrote, is about the role of institutions, as you pointed out, broadly construed to include economic and political institutions, and both formal institutions such as laws and norms, and the ways in which those institutions are applied and function. If you look at the history of economic development, or economics and social sciences, there are a lot of different ideas related to geography, culture, different types of genetical explanations, explanations based on luck or natural resources. And of course, some of those have some truth to them, but our reading of history and a lot of detailed empirical work suggests that they are all very secondary to what a society does in order to create incentives and opportunities to its people. And those are really at the realm of institutions and norms. So if you look at within Europe, for example, the places that industrialized early on and spread the more advanced 19th, 20th century technologies to the rest of the world, they weren't specifically privileged because of their geography or culture, but they were the ones that really set up a system of laws and a system of opportunities that weren't great by the standards of today, but already were a big advance relative to other countries. So it's no surprise that it wasn't Russia or Poland, but the Dutch Republic, Britain, and then France, and so on, that spearheaded European growth. when you look at the rest of the world, their institutional picture was very much shaped by both history and the colonial experience. And you see this very stark pattern, which of course I don't need to tell people from Pakistan about this, but the places like Pakistan, India, much of Africa, where European colonialism was highly exploitative and introduced repressive institutions to dominate and control the people, they did not benefit from industrialization, and they did not benefit from economic growth. But in places such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States, and a few other places where the Europeans did not settle so much, where for a variety of reasons Europeans allowed better institutions to develop, economic growth picked up. So those are just some of the sort of big picture facts from history that really underscore the role of institutions. But of course, the devil's in the details about which types of institutions, how institutions function, how institutions change, and I'm sure we'll talk about those. I don't want to take too long in response to your first question.
So, when we talk about institutions, so, like you have mentioned also in your book and in your papers, that we have both economic institutions, which, set up the incentives for people functioning within the economy, whether they want to be productive or whether they want to be extractive. So you call them, good institutions, you call inclusive institutions, which encourage or promote productive activity as opposed to redistributive or other forms of unproductive economic behavior. But aligned with these, you mention political institutions, because all the laws which govern the institutions of the economy ultimately flow from the polity and the political institutions. So can you tell us a little bit more about how these two sets of institutions align together or work together?
I think that's really critical, and in some sense, even though economists did not emphasize it greatly, economic institutions has always been part of economic thinking. When you think about the simplest economic model, it starts with a system of markets and property rights. Those are institutions. It starts with certain laws. For example, laws that say within my firm, if I'm the firm owner, I can do whatever I want and I can take the profits and they'll go to my pocket, so that incentivizes me to produce. And it prevents me from, for example, repressing my workers. Well, in many countries it doesn't, but in some countries at least it does. It prevents certain types of collusion. So those are all parts of the economic institutions. And I think most economists, when looked at it from that vantage point, would immediately recognize that those are important. I guess the part that's even a bit of a further step here is to actually recognize that these economic institutions cannot exist without some sort of political underpinning. And that is both a political structure about how laws work and what the state does, and also about political power. If all political power is vested in the owners of the biggest companies, it won't get enacted to say that collusion is not allowed, or even if you enact a law that says collusion is not allowed, you're not going to be able to enforce it, or it's going to get interpreted in a different way. So the distribution of political power and the political institutions that determine that distribution are going to matter. But even more fundamentally, political institutions shape the character of society, whether it's a repressive society, whether it's a two-tier society, what type of coercive arrangements are allowed. All of those, again, are amply illustrated by history. And the labels that we provide to these, we had long debates with Jim about what the right labels were. At the end, we ended up with these labels that say extractive economic institutions and inclusive economic institutions. Why? Extractive is to emphasize that many economic institutions, really, they are there not by mistake, but not by some haphazard choice, but they are there for a specific purpose. When in certain countries, large parts of the population don't have property rights to their land, that's because politically powerful people use that to extract resources. Or when you have coercive arrangements where people are slaves or vassals, uh, fiefs, that's again a particular structure to facilitate extraction of resources by one group from another. And in particular, in these examples, critically related to extraction of labor. And we contrasted that with inclusive economic institutions, because when you look at even the extractive economic structures, there are some people who are benefiting from it. They are actually investing, they're building big buildings and monuments, and they sometimes achieve fabulous wealth. But the rest of society is excluded. So the inclusive is meant to convey the idea that incentives and opportunities are open to a much broader segment of society. Of course, in no society it's open to everybody. Even Britain, which I mentioned, that had set up a type of institutional framework by the 17th and 18th centuries that encouraged industrialization. Women, for example, had no rights well into the second half of the 19th century. So inclusion is a gradual process, but this contrast nevertheless captures the essence of what we want to say. Inclusion is about having a broad base of people who have the opportunity to participate in economic action, and they have protections that provide incentives for them. And then for political institutions, we really think that they are organically linked with economic institutions. So we call political institutions that concentrate political power, that monopolize political power in the hands of a small group, extractive political institutions, and distribute that political power, such as a democratic society, although democracy is not sufficient, but such as a democratic society, we call those inclusive political institutions. So inclusive political and economic institutions support each other, extractive political and extractive economic institutions support each other. But of course, history is much more complicated, as we discussed in detail. There are many examples of mixtures of these in the past and in the present.
Okay, so now when we talk about, a colonial settlement, and you have an excellent paper on this, where you talk about how, the colonists set up, that the economic performance was very different in different colonies. And one of the reasons which you give in your paper is that in colonies where the Europeans wanted to settle or could settle because of the climate, they set up more inclusive economic institutions. Whereas in other countries where the temperature was hotter and so on, or there was a disease environment, like in Africa and so forth, there it was more extractive, right? But the question really here is, as far as the political institutions were concerned in both these cases, they were extractive in the sense that they were designed ultimately to colonize, and it was they were the ones who were deciding what kind of extraction or what kind of inclusion is going to take place. So how do we square that? How do we, because you argue that inclusive political institutions are in some sense causally related to inclusive economic institutions. So
yes, thanks for asking that. But as I mentioned, history is much more mixed, and in fact, I think there is a reading of our theory which is incorrect. Going back to the colonial origins paper, we emphasize this, but perhaps our language wasn't precise enough. That sometimes it suggests that Europeans from the beginning set up better inclusive institutions. That's never been the case. Europeans themselves, even though a process of institutional change had started in Europe, were a very hierarchical society. And often it was the European elites who spearheaded colonial activity, and they took other Europeans as their servants or as their underlings, sometimes even worse. I think a best example for that is Australia. It was started as a penal colony. When you look at the early days of Australia, it was extremely repressive. And there was no inclusive economic institution either, because people were convict laborers. But the Aboriginal population of Australia died or murdered by Europeans, and it wasn't very large anyway. And the sons and daughters of convicts started clamoring for better rights and better treatment. First came economic rights, so they became smallholders. But then that wasn't enough because political power was in the hands of the elite, the prison administrators and the colonial officers and a sprinkling of other British elites. And as we emphasize in the book, when you have off-diagonal elements, extractive economic institutions and inclusive political institutions, or extractive political institutions and economic institutions that are inclusive, there's a tension there. So you experience that tension for a period of over 5 decades in Australia, where now the Australians, the people, the majority of them, sons and daughters of former convicts or their grandchildren, and a small group of other settlers who had come, started asking for greater and greater political rights. And as a result, Australia at some point was the democratic leader in the world because that struggle resulted in more and more rights being distributed to the regular people in Australia. Now, in that process, the fact that Australia did not have an indigenous population mattered greatly, because if it had an indigenous population, the elites would have still wanted to hang on to political power even more strongly, because that meant controlling that indigenous population, extracting resources from that indigenous population. And that, I guess, where racism might probably played a very important role, that they had less willingness to use extreme force, although they did in many instances, but generally they had less willingness to use extreme force on white settlers than indigenous population. So when the white settlers organized and asked for rights, that was very effective. Whereas when it was, indigenous populations in Latin America or India or Africa, that didn't work out so well. So, and then, this pattern in Australia is exactly what happened in the US as well. It wasn't that the British colonizers, gave rights with open arms, although they set up an legal framework that may have helped to some degree, but most of the rights were taken by settlers in a struggle, and then political revolutions that happened both locally and nationally. So I think that really highlights why, as you point out, this process of starting with political power at the top gradually changed. It wasn't like from the beginning, it comes with a package of inclusive economic and political institutions, the best of all worlds.
Okay, in your book, you mention at some length that how authoritarian political institutions where power is concentrated at the top tend to lead to unsustainable growth. You do mention, for instance, you give two examples. One is of the former USSR, and and then you mention China also. So my question here is that in states, including in some countries like Pakistan, where there's this constant tension between political rights and political freedoms, and a more broad-based question of political power, isn't there still a very large runway of growth which exists through authoritarian political institutions? So, for instance, we have seen, we saw the USSR transform from a largely agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse, although it then fell apart later. China, we've seen a remarkable transformation, which is ongoing and now is entering probably its 5th decade. So the question is that if you start with a state or a society which is relatively backward economically, won't a strong set of political institutions, what we call authoritarian institutions, actually provide a fairly large runway for growth and economic performance?
Well, yes and no. And this, in fact, is even more closely related to the theme of my more recent book with James Robinson, The Narrow Corridor. And though it is also to some degree discussed, but not as clearly in Why Nations Fail. So let me make a couple of points to set the scene and then answer your excellent question in some greater detail. First of all, it's not just China and USSR. History is full of examples of what we call in Why Nations Failed extractive growth, or in the narrow corridor, we call it despotic growth. And these are examples where growth is spearheaded by elites and state power, but despotically, meaning without including inputs or activities from the bottom, or extractive, meaning that it is part of extracting resources. The Roman Empire, which, starting with Augustus, became a very extractive political institution, power concentrated at the very top, grew for another 200 years. China has had periods of growth, the degree to which the bottom and the top balanced each other different, but it had periods of growth that lasted hundreds of years. So we're not talking, when we talk of these instabilities, like a matter of years, but we are talking about something that's different about the character of that growth than based on inclusive institutions. And that difference is really about innovation, experimentation, and bottom-up participation. When growth necessitates building dams and highways, when it requires big firms and mobilization of resources so that you take resources away from agriculture and put them in industry like China and Soviet Union did, that can be done extractively, though even in that case, you have a lot of inefficiencies, as the Russian agricultural collectivization and then based on that, the Russian industrialization indicates. Even at the early stages, there were a lot of inefficiencies, especially in agriculture, but also in industry. But that can go on for quite a while. When growth requires or is favored by taking technologies that exist in the world and importing them, like China did over the last 50 years, again, this bottom-up experimentation, new firms competing against each other, trying new things, that's less important. Now, that is the basis of our claim that there is this inherent instability limit to extractive growth. But as you pointed out, extractive growth is nothing to be poo-pooed. And the reason for that is that in many countries, much of Africa and Pakistan, especially parts of Pakistan included, the choice, at least in the short run, may not be between inclusive and extractive growth, but maybe between no growth and extractive growth. And the main reason for that is that state institutions, what we call state centralization in Why Nations Fail, may be completely absent. So if you take the situation in Waziristan in Pakistan, for example, that isn't a stepping stone to inclusive institutions. There are no state institutions. They're very difficult for the state to provide public goods or order or incentives or opportunities to be broadly distributed. So if it's a comparison of what's going to happen in Balochistan without the state or Waziristan versus, you have a heavy hand of the state like in China, of course, the heavy hand will bring you more growth. And that, we point out in the narrow corridor is the basis of the Huntingtonian fallacy. So that view, which you sort of asked me about, are associated with many leading thinkers throughout history, but most recently by the Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington, who argued both about the importance of powerful state institutions, being quite open to authoritarianism to build those powerful state institutions, and articulated the idea of state-first development, meaning you first need to beat the state, and then during that process, everything is fine, and then perhaps other things can come later. And we sort of reject that perspective. We reject that perspective, both as empirically ungrounded and conceptually not so attractive. And the reason for that is, if you look at the example of really very successful economic growth, they are not undergirded by authoritarian government, but they are undergirded by a government that's more embedded in society. So we give examples for this from the ancient world as well as from Europe. And the problem is that the sort of the view, which is associated with another leading political scientist, Martin Seymour Lipset, the modernization view, that you start with the state first and then other things will come. Democracy, rights, and broader participation will come naturally. The empirical basis of that is very weak. So coming back to the question of feasibility, you know, I think, right, you have to start building state institutions, laws, order, public services everywhere. But the main emphasis that I would put differently than perhaps your question is that that doesn't need to be authoritarian. You can build those institutions at the same time as societal participation in the economy and politics starts. But it has to start at the right speed, because otherwise it gets out of control and you end up with a situation like in Afghanistan, where tribes fight each other, or South Waziristan, or in Balochistan. So it's a balance, but that balance is feasible. It's not a choice between the two ends, authoritarian growth or no growth.
Okay. Okay, so just
are you getting a lot of noise? Is that from my headset, or?
No, I can hear you perfectly well. And
there's no background noise that you're getting?
No, I'm not getting it.
Okay.
Maybe it's
I'm getting it, but it might be because of my headset. Okay. As long as it's good at your end.
I can hear you.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so just to delve slightly a little bit more on China. So you mentioned that authoritarian growth is not sustainable for two main reasons. One is that it doesn't really allow creative destruction, which basically means innovation, which allows which basically comes through competition and which upends the usual order of things. And the second thing that you mention is that authoritarian political institutions are frequently unstable, because there's if somebody people will try and capture that power which has been concentrated amongst a few people. So there can be other cliques or other factions who might try and capture that. So my question here relating to China, as we have seen that the Chinese over the last 10, 15 years have, through a very concerted set of policies, focused on trying to innovate. Whether that's through getting their local state firms to compete with private ones, or whether it is even setting up universities and getting world-class academics to come and teach there. So my question here is that do you see China? Do you still see China spluttering over the next 25 years, 20 to 25 years, with the measures that they're taking?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. And the honest answer is, I don't know. At some level, what James and I did is we formulated a theory, an expansive theory, in our work in Why Nations Failed, and also subsequently in the narrow corridor. And we drew out its logical implications. And of course, no theory is perfect, and there may be aspects of this theory that are wrong. And I think China is always the most challenging, difficult case. What I would say is that looking at China from the viewpoint of our framework, what I see exactly the dynamics of our theory playing out in China. Many factors that we did not have in our framework and we did not anticipate coming into play, and I'll mention those as well. So in terms of what are the parts of the theory that seem to hold up reasonably well? First of all, we are seeing in China that the political system that was, as we mentioned it, very fragile, very extractive because it was a communist party dominating the rest of society, but tried to hold a meritocratic structure within the communist party. That's coming apart. With Xi Jinping, you have much greater repression. The checks and balances that supposedly existed within the Communist Party are shown to be a joke. And you see the naked repression of that's always at the background of extractive regimes, even if it's not in the foreground, that's coming to the fore. You're also seeing the economic contradictions of the system. Inefficiencies are building up, growth is slowing down, and there is a painful transition, which we'll see whether it happens or not. It's one of two transitions that are really critical. One of them is transitioning from an export economy to a consumption economy. And you do that while still keeping the middle classes politically docile. That's going to, that remains to be seen. But I think there are also some special things about China. And let me mention three things that are very special. One, I would sort of say it's still part of our framework, but we don't have a great explanation. And then the other two are wild cards. The first one is that, to the best of my knowledge, China is the only extractive despotic regime in history that understands that its Achilles heel is innovation. Most despotic regimes feared innovation or had no need for them or were indifferent to it. So the fact that despotic authoritarian regimes were not good at innovation and experimentation wasn't a problem. China, or Chinese leadership, at least subconsciously understands that innovation is a problem for them. And that's why they are building a huge number of universities. That's why they're giving an enormous amount of resources to firms and universities and researchers so that they are more innovative. China now soon is going to outspend the whole entire world in terms of what it pours into universities. So that's a new thing in some sense. And then the question is, if you have a natural disadvantage at innovation because you're a despotic regime, but you realize it and you put more and more emphasis on it, can you undo that natural advantage? My answer is no, because that natural advantage comes from the fear that people will have in experimenting, in really trying new things, and you cannot break that with just resources. So that's within the logic of our model, but it's still a wild card. The next two, I think, are even wilder cards. One is AI. So when we wrote Why Nations Fail, we did not, fully anticipate how big data will be. And, I'm still unsure. How much advantage does data confer to your companies, to your efficiency increasing activities? My view is it's more like limited increasing returns. You need a certain amount of data for many activities, but after a while, perhaps it's not so useful. But imagine that we have a world of unbounded increasing returns, which means the more data you get, the better you are. China is big, but more importantly, because of its despotic structure, has no privacy limits. So perhaps Chinese companies are going to become the AI leaders, even if they don't have the same experimentation drive as in societies in an inclusive, or companies in an inclusive society, because they're going to be able to harness and mine the data of 2 billion people. Whereas European companies, they have to deal with much smaller data, with many regulations, many privacy constraints on what they can do. How much the advantage? I don't know the answer to that. And then the second wilder card, is of course the world economic order. So, we were quite aware of the problems of the United States. And we write about them in detail in the narrow corridor. But over the last 2 years since we wrote the narrow corridor, the unraveling of the US, which we feared and warned against, has taken place at much, much faster speed than anybody could have imagined. And whether that means that the world order is going to change in a way that creates an advantage for China, again, I think that's a wilder card. Again, I wouldn't put my money on the whole world becoming a Chinese version, China leading technology and economic growth, and other countries emulating China as a stable system. And I see many, many problems with that, both in terms of its desirability and in terms of its sustainability. But of course, those are the questions we have to grapple with.
Okay, so now a very important part of the book and of your work, and in fact institutional economics as a field, is the concept of path dependence. Which is basically that when societies or countries get onto certain paths, whether they're economic paths or political paths, they tend to be self-sustaining or self-reinforcing. So you can get into what you mentioned in your book. You can get into a virtuous cycle. So you start with growth and then it keeps replicating, or you can get into the opposite, where actually you start unraveling. So my question is, which obviously you also discuss in your book, is that how do countries break out of a mold? So if you are stuck in a low growth trap, in a low growth trap, how do you break out of that cycle? And I will root this question in Pakistan's case, which grew fairly quickly for the first 45 odd years, did better than its peers. And over the last 15 to 20 years, we've seen a kind of a secular falling away from the region in terms of its growth performance. So how do countries, who get on to, suboptimal growth paths, break out of the mold?
Well, there is no silver bullet. There isn't like a one-liner that says, okay, this is what you do and you get in there. And in some sense, that's the difference between institutional political economy explanations and the earlier sort of more naive development recommendations that the World Bank used to sort of suggest to countries, build more dams and factories and you'll be fine. And then it was build more schools and you'll be fine. And it's not that simple. And of course, I don't want to be pretentious and tell people who live in Pakistan and know its history, extremely well, that I can, from my couch here, diagnose the problems of Pakistan. But I happen to have written one paper on Pakistan, and in that paper, fortunately I had two Pakistani co-authors, Ali Chema and Asim Khwaja, so at least they can mask my lack of knowledge about Pakistan. But we focus on something I believe is central for Pakistan's political economic failure, which is failure and disintegration of state institutions. And the problem that we put somewhat more generally, but investigate within the context of Pakistan, is once you have failing state institutions, legal system that doesn't work, police that are corrupt, repressive, or disinterested, or don't provide services, schools likewise, how do you build trust while also improving these services? And one problem that is relevant to many countries, many parts of Pakistan included, is that when state institutions fail, then non-state actors fill in that void. Some of those non-state actors can be violent and a big existential threat to the state and the nation, such as Taliban. Others may be more benign, such as panchayats or local religious leaders. But in all cases, once these non-state actors start taking away the role of the state, it creates a vicious circle. The state fails, people stop trusting the state, they turn to the non-state actors, they work with the non-state actors, they start trusting them, or at least having a working relationship, so they trust the state less. The state trusted less, has less cooperation from society, it deepens this failure. Again, those are themes that aren't really brought out in the Why Nations Fail, but they are central to the thesis of the narrow corridor, where state-society cooperation is really critical for institutions to function. Again, if you look at South Waziristan or Balochistan, I think those are extreme cases, such as Afghanistan. But for example, in the case of our paper, we don't look at such extreme places. We look at Lahore and rural parts of Lahore, exactly the same problem. And what we try to show that, in fact, there is a way out. And the way out is that if you somehow break the cycle and start improving state institutions and at the same time provide truthful, credible information to people, they are so hungry for public services that they will start working with the state. And then once they do so, they will distance themselves from the non-state actors that are undermining state institutions. It's not an easy path, and we do this in the short run. We don't know whether it's sustainable in the long run. That's part of a now ongoing additional investigation, but that's part of the fabric of building institutions. You have to build better institutions, starting at the local level, starting at the level of providing services to people. And we have other examples, not from Pakistan, but from other parts of the world in the narrow corridor, which show how that can be done at the local level. But you need a sort of a change in perspective, leadership, and a real ability to improve state institutions while at the same time giving voice to the people. Because if you go there with an authoritarian agenda, I'm going to clamp down on corruption Chinese style. I'm going to bring you schools, but it's just what I say. People are going to say no to that. They're going to be very cautious. They're not going to cooperate with it. And it's not going to start the same virtuous circle. So that's why this is coming from the bosom of society is really important.
Okay. In your book and in your work, you also mention, that one way out, of certain, path trajectories are what you call critical junctures or extreme events which shake up the entire order. So you mentioned how, in the 14th century, the Black Plague, which almost wiped out, 50% of Europe by some estimates, upended the institutional structure of feudalism which existed and actually unleashed, a new growth path, which ultimately then led on to the Industrial Revolution and so forth. So in this context, we are living today in a time of pandemic. And so let me ask you a kind of a cliched question. Do you think that COVID-19 could be a critical juncture for countries?
Yes, I do. I very much do. It is in some sense the Black Death of the 21st century. Fortunately, it's not going to be, hopefully it's not going to be as deadly. Fortunately, hopefully it's not going to be as destructive. But I think what is a critical juncture? The way that we define it is that it's an event when existing institutions completely prove to be inadequate for the challenges ahead, so that institutional change becomes almost inevitable. And the direction of that institutional change is very much shaped by idiosyncratic differences, existing institutional balances, small differences. And I think that's exactly what we are living through. The challenge is very different for developing countries than developed countries. And in fact, I think it's a bigger wake-up call for developed countries. Because developing countries, I mean, I think it's no news to anybody in Pakistan that its institutions are failing, that something new was needed in Pakistan. I think every voter in Pakistan knows that. That's probably why, many people voted for Imran Khan. He was a new face. He pointed out that the justice system wasn't working, the school system wasn't working, the state wasn't working. So that's true in many, many countries. It's true in India. It's true in much of sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. But for the developed countries, there was the conceit that things are fine. In the US, for example, the Constitution protects us. We have the best economy. We have the best states. And that's all been shown to be false, completely inadequate. So I think this is time for institutional change. And that's why I believe, I mean, I'm not an objective person, but I think when it comes to this, but I'm not an impartial observer, but I think that's why the themes of our conversation here, institutions, different models of economic and political growth, are going to be crucial. Which lessons are we going to learn? Are we going to emulate China because they could send the drones to deal with coronavirus? Or are we going to give even more power to tech companies because they are the ones that can do contact tracing, and they are the ones that are making the economy function by sending packages and enabling us to use Zoom? Or are we going to try to build a better set of state institutions that will not allow somebody like Donald Trump to come to power again, that does not allow 40 million Americans to not to have access to healthcare, that doesn't allow endemic poverty, that doesn't allow unemployment to rise to 20% as in some parts of Europe, that undergirds better freedoms and better economic opportunities for people. So those are, I think, the questions and some of the lessons that we've talked about here, I think, are critical in that endeavor. Jakub, you can hear me, right?
Yeah, I can hear you. I don't know. I think we have lost Savail. So let's just ask you a couple of questions.
Perfect. That sounds great. That's what I was going to suggest. Thank you.
Sort of come in. So the first question is from Dr. Taimur Rahman, and he's asking that the inclusive institutions that you've spoken about are the ones that have waged war throughout the 20th century to ensure that extractive institutions are maintained in other parts of the world. Do you think that this pattern will ever change? Because once this hegemony is kind of in place, why would these first world countries, so to speak, change this system?
Perfect. Thank you very much for asking that. This is actually a very, very important point, and it's something we do talk about, not so much for the 20th century, but much more for the 19th century and 18th century in why nations fail. At the time that Britain, for example, was becoming more inclusive, for example, extending the franchise to more and more fraction of the population, it was also exporting the most extractive and harsh institutions to the rest of the world. So inclusivity is only relative to the groups that are represented. That's why politics really matters. So Britain had no qualms in, being involved in the slave trade for a while, even after the slave trade was banned, benefiting from slave-based plantations in Jamaica and Barbados, and even after that was banned from other colonies in Africa and India. The reason for that is because the political rights of the regular people in Britain were obtained by their struggle. They forced the elites to give them rights, and once they had that political voice, the system had to change in a more inclusive direction to give them more of the opportunities and the incentives that I talked about. But people in India, in Pakistan, in Africa didn't have that political power, so inclusivity didn't apply to them. And I think that is a general rule. We don't go into the details of that as much as one should, precisely because we focused on domestic politics, not international politics, but international politics is critical. And I think today what we are seeing is that in some sense there is a return of great power politics with the US and Russia and China. So these are not questions that were in the past. If we are going to be optimistic, and I think the grounds for optimism aren't natural or aren't that strong, but you can still think about them, is that this will change only when we are also able to build functioning international institutions. So as long as the seat of power is just in nations without any constraints, nations are always going to find ways of damaging other countries when it's in their interest. So that's why bodies like European Union within Europe are very critical. Unfortunately, United Nations cannot play that role at the international level. It's not that powerful. We see WHO completely failing, for example, in the current pandemic. So we need to build better, much more powerful institutions at the international level to be able to deal with that.
Let me ask you another question, Professor Acemoglu. Abdul Wase has a question, and he asks and says, hasn't the pandemic equaled the difference between inclusive and extractive institutions? Because of course, everyone has been badly affected by this. So where do you see the effect of the pandemic on it in the long term?
That's a great question. There is no doubt that such an unusual event that actually really brings out the weaknesses of many societies. So it has really hit the United States because all that inequality, socioeconomic inequality, health inequality that had accumulated in the United States over the last 3.5 decades or 4 decades really became the Achilles heel of the US system. So in some sense, it has reduced the US performance and US prestige relative to China. But I don't agree that it has completely erased the differences between inclusivity and extraction. If you look at the societies that have done best in terms of dealing with the pandemic, both socially, economically, and from a public health point of view, they are inclusive societies with functioning state institutions and where people do have some degree of trust in their institutions. Germany, Denmark, Norway, Taiwan, South Korea. I think the reason why US and the UK have failed so badly, so spectacularly, and with probably costing hundreds of thousands of lives by the end of it, is because their inclusive institutions were coming to the brink of failure before then, especially for the US, but also for the UK, the dynamics weren't very good. So I think it's those weaknesses that have really been exploited by the pandemic.
Yes. So related to that, Dr. Miftah Ismail is asking that you mentioned also earlier about unraveling of the US. Could you speak more about that? How do you think the US is being unraveled, so to speak, these days and in the future?
Well, I mean, I think the US institutions have really been damaged. And again, that was true before the pandemic. We have had a historic increase in polarization. Congress has lost all of its institutional role as a control on the president. I think most importantly, Donald Trump's presidency has destroyed the role of independent autonomous bureaucracy. The thing that I said Pakistan had a real problem with judiciary, police, agencies that deal with diseases, with space, with environment. Those actually, always had their problems, but they functioned reasonably well. Now they have come to the brink of failure. And that's part of the reason why CDC has been such a big, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in the US has been such a huge failure. Just 8 years ago, it did extremely well when it was dealing with Ebola. But today, because of that erosion, has really played no leadership role. I think those are the tensions that we are seeing. And that's the point where we have these institutions coming apart. If another term of Trump presidency is imposed on the United States, I think that failure will become deeper. But even if Trump is kicked out of office, I think rebuilding institutions is not an easy task.
Okay, sorry, I'm back. Can you hear me now?
I can. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so actually two quick last questions. The first one is from Hadid Baloch, who is asking, what is the future for the Middle East, for oil-rich countries, which also have very authoritarian or extractive political institutions? Can they continue to grow? And the second question is from me, and that is, how do you see the future of institutional economics? Because one of the criticisms that we hear is that there's not enough policy advice that we can give as institutional economists, because we tend to speak in more broad terms. So is there any way that we can concretize some of the insights that we have in this field?
Yes, absolutely. Let me start with that. And I think that is a very, very important challenge. We, again, try to go some more steps in that direction in our new book, The Narrow Corridor. I think the easiest thing to do there is to start at the local level. The national level is, of course, where a lot of things matter. But the politics is so complicated at the national level. The local level actually provides some easier place to see about how we can build institutions, how we can get the balance between state and society right. And we show some examples of how things go right or wrong at the local politics level, local state building level in the book. And I think that's what my research in the context of Pakistan has been about and will continue to be. So I believe we can go in that direction. And also we can go in the direction of providing a very clear understanding of how institutions need to change as the world changes. Globalization, automation, pandemics, I think all of those are very much new questions for all of social sciences, and institutional economics is well placed to tackle them. But the world is a complex place. And I think understanding and being honest about that is the right kind of humility. I think one problem with many branches of economics is that we tend to play God. We tend to come up with solutions that are really devoid of real practicality because they don't recognize the specific context that you recognize. When you go to a place where there are, there's a 200 years or 2,000 years of lack of property rights and traditional economic relations and traditional social norm-based allocation of resources, and you say, okay, we're going to improve efficiency by bringing titling, I think that just is devoid of the understanding of the context. And I think institutional economics is a very important part of getting the right humility for social sciences. And talking of humility, I think that's what we need about Middle East. The Middle East is a very, very complex place. History, religion, geopolitics, international politics, they all complicate things. As we were finishing the Why Nations Fail and writing the preface, the Arab Spring broke out. And we wrote the preface about the Arab Spring, about why there is hope for the Middle East, but that is a very dangerous path and it may spin out of control. And unfortunately, it has spun out of control with the exception of perhaps Tunisia. And we've had one of the biggest humanitarian disasters of the last several decades in Syria and to some degree in Iraq. So I don't think the future is easy, and it's partly because of exactly what one of your listeners asked a second ago, geopolitics of it. The power struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran and Israel really complicates politics, and it's a very repressive set of regimes, and they are very authoritarian while at the same time being very weak, that in the sense that their state institutions are not working, they're not providing public services. So it's going to be a very difficult transition for much of the Middle East.
Okay, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Professor
Thank you,
Acemoglu.
Savail, and
Pleasure
thank you.
and joy.